Egresado de la carrera en psicología, es el director de estrategia de Sonic para Studio Resonate, una consultoría creativa interna de audio que ofrece soporte a las marcas que se anuncian en las plataformas Pandora, SiriusXM, Stitcher y SoundCloud. Steve cuenta con más de 30 años de experiencia en la industria de la música y la publicidad, explorando las formas en que la música y el sonido impactan la percepción y el comportamiento del consumidor. Debido a su trabajo, recibió la beca iHeartMedia para liderazgo en innovación de audio y actualmente está completando una maestría en administración de empresas. Ejecutivo a través de la Escuela de Liderazgo Creativo de Berlín, enfocado en cómo las marcas pueden medir y predecir los retornos de las inversiones en audio de manera más efectiva. Él es Steve Keller.
Hello, and thanks so much for joining me today for MERKFEST 2021. I'm sorry I can't be there with you personally, but hopefully this is the next best thing. Today, I want to share with you the importance of sonic strategy and the role it can play in helping you harness the power of sound to shape consumer perception and behavior. I'm going to set the stage with 3 observations. First, we know that sound moves us. The soundtrack of our lives is scored by music, sounds, and voices that punctuate significant events. Our first romance, our first breakup, a sound from our childhood that takes us back to a particular time or place. No one questions the fact that sound is powerful. As advertisers, brands, and communicators, we know the power of music and sound to arouse us, to make us feel things, to connect us emotionally to a product or message. And yet, sound continues to be an undervalued asset. It's often the last thing we think about in a campaign. We've thought carefully about the words we're using in our scripts, how to capture the right tone of voice, but when it comes to actually selecting the voice to deliver the copy, well, we have very few guidelines or standards in place to help us make disciplined decisions. Music choices are last minute, decided in editing and subject to personal biases. Think about it this way. The visual identities of our brands have been carefully, thoughtfully developed. We can deliver our brand colors to exact specifications. We have style guides to provide rules for the use of visual properties, logos, and typography. We've registered trademarks to protect those properties and make sure we're consistent and disciplined in their use. But when it comes to sound, we're changing our voice with every new piece of communication. Very few brands have standards and style guides in place to ensure disciplined, consistent choices for the way they sound. There's a disconnect between what we know and how we act when it comes to the use of sound in our brand identity and messaging. Which brings us to the 3rd observation. We've entered the platinum age of audio, an age where being heard as a brand is as important as being seen. In an era of smart speakers, voice interactivity, and audio interfaces, the conversation around sonic identity and sound choices is now front and center. And as is often the case, there's good news and bad news to this. The good news is we're having these kind of conversations, and I have an opportunity to speak to you at conferences like MERKFEST. We're recognizing that we need to change the way we think about sound, how we value it, how we measure its effectiveness. We're finally closing the value perception gap between believing in the power of sound and being willing to invest the time and resources that it takes to harness it. So the bad news? Well, we're creatures of habit. So for all the excitement around the platinum age of audio, for all the interest in sonic identities and voice activations, we're tempted to think about sound as we always have, as a tactical tool. We jump to the execution, to creating the content, to talking about the best practices. We want that audio logo, that brand theme, that jingle, that functional sound. We're focused on what we hear. Well, instead of just jumping directly to the execution, we need to step back and start thinking about sound as a strategy rather than just a tactic. So today, I'm going to take you on a little journey. We'll start with some sound science to give you a little bit of knowledge and inspiration around the power of sound. From there, we'll talk a little bit about the process that goes into creating a sonic identity. We'll then explore something that I call audio alchemy. It's a blend of sound science and sound art that helps us translate brand values and attributes into a sonic language. And finally, I'm going to draw it all together with a strategic framework to help you make sound choices, literally and figuratively, that can ultimately help you improve the return on your audio investments. So open your minds and your ears, and let's dive into a little sound science. Why does sound have such an impact on our perception and behavior? Well, one reason is because we're literally wired for sound. The brain's auditory circuitry is less widely distributed than its visual system. And as a result, sound gets routed quickly to the precortical areas of the brain where emotions are generated. In fact, our response time to what we hear is anywhere from 20 to 100 times faster than what we see. Sound moves so quickly that it has the potential to set the stage for how we interpret all the other sensory information that follows it. And that's probably the result of evolution. Our ancestors no doubt heard that animal that was about to eat them before they saw it. Another aspect of this wiring is the connection between sound and memory. Sound has the potential to evoke memories in our brain. Earlier, I mentioned the soundtrack of our lives, pieces of music or sounds that are associated with our life experiences. Well, this pairing of a sound stimulus with an event creates a powerful memory trigger. There's been some amazing work with Alzheimer's patients where the research shows that listening to music results in specific activations of the areas of the brain associated with memory. We can use this idea of paired associations to create sonic memories of brands too. When you hear this, you think of this, Intel. Well, we can use these mnemonic or memory devices to create immediate associations with brands. We call them by a variety of names: sonic logos, audio logos, sound logos. And these sonic logos are to your ear what a visual logo is to your eye. It's a short collection of sounds or notes that, upon hearing them, triggers a memory of the brand that they represent. How many of these do you recognize? That's the power of paired association. That's sonic branding in its simplest form. So we know sound can trigger memories, but sound also produces a physiological response. Sorry if that triggered a moment of panic. For most of us, that particular sound produces a chemical reaction in our brains. A shot of cortisol triggers the flow of adrenaline, putting us into a higher state of arousal and alertness. Sound can trigger the production of other chemicals in our brains too. Chemicals like dopamine that activate the reward circuit of our brains, helping to create feelings of euphoria. Music is a huge dopamine trigger. In those moments of paired associations, our brain learns to give us a little jolt of dopamine. In fact, research shows that the response to music is so powerful, over time, we don't even need to hear the music. Just thinking about it can give us that dopamine rush. There are other chemicals at play too when music tickles our ears, like oxytocin. Oxytocin relaxes us. It helps us feel like we belong and amplifies our feelings of trust. When we're together, particularly when we're listening to the same piece of music, singing along, moving in time to the rhythm, oxytocin is released. Research has shown that one of the benefits of this kind of group singing and synchronous movement is that afterwards, we engage in more pro-social behavior. Imagine if we could harness these powerful chemical responses in the context of our brand experiences. A few years ago, Martin Lindstrom wanted to see if certain sounds produced a greater physiological response than others. He worked with a team of neuroscientists wiring 50 volunteers to capture their galvanic, pupil, and brainwave responses to sound. A myriad of sounds were played to the experiment's participants and then ranked according to the strength of the participants' response. One of those sounds was this. And can you guess where it ranked in the top 50 sounds? Number 2. Interestingly enough, the sound of birdsong didn't even rank in the top 10. In fact, it was so powerful that there was only one sound that beat out the sound of the Intel Sonic logo. The sound of a baby giggling. I'm not sure if that's good for Intel or bad for the human race. I'll let you decide. So sound in a brand context can produce paired associations and trigger strong physiological responses. But what about behavior? Well, that seems like a big leap. It's one thing to say sound evokes memories or that we have a physiological reaction to it, but can it actually shape our behavior? More specifically, can it make a difference in our buying decisions, even when we're not aware it's happening? Well, to illustrate this, I want to take you shopping for some wine. We head to the store, we walk to the wine section, we see the French wines, we see the German wines, we grab a bottle of French wine and head to the checkout. On the way out, a researcher stops us and begins to ask some questions. Why did you pick that bottle of wine? Well, we like the design on the label or the name, or we wanted a nice red wine. Then the researcher asks, did you happen to notice what was playing in the background? Well, when they performed this experiment, only a very small percentage of the people even noticed the music. An even smaller percentage said it had anything to do with their choice of wine. But when the researchers analyzed the data, they found that when French music was playing, 77% of the wines that were sold were French. Now, you might not think that's a particularly big deal. French wines are popular after all, so statistically, you might expect that there would be a higher percentage of French wine sold regardless. But here's the trick. There were other days when they played German music, and on those days, 73% of the wines that were sold were German. So simply changing the soundtrack in the store environment had a significant impact on consumers' purchase behavior. We're wired for sound. And as a result, sound has an impact on our memories, our physiology, and our behavior. When we understand the power of sound, it begs the question, are we making the kind of sound choices that allow us to harness its power, that produce the perceptual and behavioral outcomes we desire? Framed that way, we start to understand that building a sonic identity isn't simply about slapping an audio logo on the end of our spots. Sonic identity then is less an exercise in music or sound production. It's a process. And this process, like any branding initiative, starts with a period of discovery and design. What can we learn about the brand? What do consumer insights and research tell us about the brand? How is the brand chosen to define these attributes, values, and its meaning? We'll conduct a series of discovery interviews and audits that help us understand the sonic history of the brand, the competitive landscape sonically, and the audio ecosystem in which the brand operates. And once we've finished this initial design phase, we take everything that we've learned about the brand and use a number of techniques and workshops to help us translate brand values, attributes, and personality into a sonic language. It's only after this period of discovery and design that we're ready to task our composers and designers with the creation of a series of prototypes that will ultimately form the core of the brand's sonic DNA, whether that be a brand theme, a sonic logo, functional sounds as part of the user experience or user interface, or even the sound of the product itself. After internal evaluation and revisions of the prototypes, we're ready to see how the final assets work out in the world. This is the testing phase, where we work with our research partners to measure how well the designs are working across a whole range of parameters, recall, appeal, brand fit, category associations, engagement, benchmarks, and more. We have a whole range of metrics we can tailor to the specific needs of our brand partners. Testing helps us zero in on which of the prototypes best aligns brand intent with consumer perception. So now that we have these audio assets, we need to turn our attention to their implementation and how we manage their use across an entire audio ecosystem. Part of that management involves the creation of an audio style guide to ensure that we're using our audio assets as often as possible, as consistently as possible, and in as many contexts as possible that allow us to deliver equity in our sonic brand over time. Now, at this point, hopefully you're beginning to realize the role that sonic strategy plays in crafting a sonic identity. I'm fond of saying, creating a sonic identity doesn't start with your ears. It actually starts with what's between them. Getting there involves a bit of what we call audio alchemy. It's a blend of sound science and sound art that produces the sonic magic that will move, delight, and motivate our listeners. Now, I use a number of tools to help make that sonic magic happen, and I'm going to pull back the curtain and share 3 of those with you today. First, emotion and mood. How can we sonically target particular emotions or mood states? Well, this diagram illustrates the work of a researcher by the name of James Russell, who suggested that emotions are essentially a combination of 2 continuums: arousal, or energy, and valence, which is just a psychological term that suggests whether an experience is pleasant or unpleasant. Higher states of arousal and pleasure produce feelings of excitement. Lower the arousal, and we feel more relaxed. If we keep the arousal low but move towards something that's unpleasant, well, it produces feelings more associated with depression. And higher states of arousal and unpleasantness produce feelings of distress and anxiety. Research helps us understand the sonic building blocks of emotion, where arousal and valence result from how we play with tempo, the modality, whether it's major or minor, harmony, dissonance, and pitch. Listen to this piece of music. Slower tempo, simple harmony, lower pitch, the smooth connection between the notes all help convey a sense of relaxation. But if we kick up the tempo, raise the pitch, and sharpen the attack of the notes, we can convey feelings of arousal and excitement. Understanding this relationship between arousal and pleasure and the musical building blocks that affect both, we can better communicate with composers and musicians, and helping them to more precisely hit these emotional targets. Now, the next tool I want to use draws on research based on a field of psychological science we call psychophysics. Psychophysics is a branch of psychology that deals with the relationship between physical stimuli and mental phenomena. More specifically, it's the study of how we interpret the world around us based on input from our senses. Have you heard of synesthesia? Well, synesthesia is a condition in which one sense is simultaneously perceived as if it were another. For a synesthete, hearing a certain sound might trigger an associated smell or be perceived as if it were a certain color. Their sensory input is literally cross-wired. Interestingly enough, research has found that all of us are to some degree natural synesthetes. Our brain works cross-modally as it seeks to interpret interactions between all of the sensory modalities. Now, let me illustrate this for you. Here's a fun little exercise where I'm going to show you 2 shapes. One of these shapes is a booba, and one is a kiki. So which is the booba and which is the kiki? That's right. How did you know? Well, it just looks like a booba, right? The round edges of the design, even the shape of the letters, match the softer sounds of booba, just like the sharp consonants of kiki naturally seem to match the spiked edges of the design. Now, these associations exist for the most part around the world and across cultures and languages. And while we may not know exactly why our perception works this way, we do know that what is key to the experience is a sense of congruency. Somehow, we just sense that these things match. Research shows us that there's power in congruency, particularly when it comes to our senses. Align the sensory input, and you significantly increase the power of the experience. Incongruence, where things don't quite fit, can capture our attention, but ultimately, beyond an initial curiosity, we tend to avoid things that aren't congruent. Now, if we apply these concepts to our brand sound, we begin to understand that the more we can align all the sensory input, the more congruent the consumer experience is of our brands. Our research shows that we can use sound to hack our perception of color, taste, or even texture. And this is where it gets really exciting. Take, for example, our perception of flavor. If I know how to combine the sonic seasonings in the right way, I can change your perception of flavor by concentrating on what's hitting your earbuds and not just your taste buds. We know from research that if you pop a bit of chocolate in your mouth, this soundscape will make it taste a bit more bitter. It's low, slow, and legato. Change a few of the sonic seasonings, and now, well, that sounds sweet, doesn't it? We can do the same for spiciness with a spicy soundtrack. And all of the soundscapes I've just played for you have been tested, and we found that they actually can change your perception of flavor. And we can perform similar sonic sensory hacks with colors and textures, even smells. The final tool I want to share with you is one based on my research into the concept of audio archetypes. Swiss psychiatrist Carl Jung noticed that there were certain characters and symbols that regularly appeared in stories and mythologies throughout history and across diverse cultures. He called these reoccurring themes archetypes. Now, Jung had identified 12 basic archetypes like the rebel, the lover, the hero, the jester, and so on. Brands often use archetypal language to help them provide a context for brand meaning and narrative. The hero brand, the explorer brand, the rebel brand. Archetypes also provide us with a framework to anchor emotions. Happy to a jester may sound different than happy to a rebel. Now, I wondered if there might actually be audio archetypes, combinations of sonic building blocks that don't just communicate emotion, but communicate meaning as well. For instance, we might hear this and think of the jester, or hear this and think of the lover, or this as the hero. Now, our research suggests that audio archetypes do exist, and that we not only communicate emotion with music, but we communicate meaning as well. We've been able to use neuroscience, monitoring heart rate, brain waves, and eye tracking to see the impact of these soundtracks on test subjects as they watch commercials. By simply changing the soundtrack of the commercial, we're able to change where the subjects were looking, how long they focused on a particular scene. We induce changes in arousal, motivation, and how hard their brains were working as they were watching the commercial. By choosing a different audio archetype, we're able to change the viewer's perception and reaction to the visual content. Now, let's bring all this back home to where we started. The platinum age of audio opens up new opportunities to harness the power of sound in new and more creative ways. But it's not enough to approach sound as a tactic. In order to really harness the power of sound, we need to have a sonic strategy. If you're a marketing strategist, you're probably familiar with the work of Peter Field and Les Binet, who analyzed the econometric data of 700 brands across 996 campaigns and 83 brand categories over the course of 30 years. They wanted to examine the differences in results of brand messaging that focused on short-term sales activation against brand messaging that focused on building long-term brand equity. Short-term sales activations are usually focused on price, promotions, and rational benefits. Now, Peter and Les found that this kind of messaging is certainly effective. You see the lift in sales, but you also see a quick fall off over time, and the pattern just continues. Brand perceptions are unchanged, and there's no long-term increase in sales. Long-term brand building, on the other hand, results in an increase in brand equity, most often appealing to emotional connections between brands and consumers. In fact, when the returns were measured at the end of the day, long-term brand building resulted in twice the revenue generated by short-term sales activation alone. Not only that, but over time, long-term brand building reduced the effects of price sensitivity. Now, it's not that you shouldn't do short-term sales activation. It's that you need a balance. And in the case of most B2C brands, Binet and Field found the optimal marketing mix to be 60% long-term brand building and 40% short-term sales activation. Now, let's think about this in the context of sonic strategy, particularly as it applies to audio-only platforms like radio or streaming. Very often, we use audio-only platforms for short-term activations. The messages are usually price and promotion-driven, wall-to-wall voiceover, and touting the rational benefits of the brand. What if instead of limiting audio messaging to short-term sales activation, we lean into the power of sound to create emotional connections too, and use sound to craft long-term, emotionally appealing communications that build brand equity? What if we use audio assets like brand themes or sonic logos in our short-term activations that help us build brand linkage and recognition through the consistent use of sound across all our brand communication? Well, that's the sonic long and the short of it. Now, speaking of audio assets, let's do a little compare and contrast. Brands rely on the use of distinct brand assets to create memory structures, linkage, and salience, which is just a fancy way of saying attention or prominence. In a recent study, Ipsos reviewed a sample of over 2,000 US audiovisual advertisements. The study wanted to examine the kind of distinct assets that brands were leveraging. It shouldn't come as a surprise that the majority of the distinctive assets used in commercials were visual in nature. In fact, visual assets accounted for 92% of the total assets used, with brands leaning heavily into logos and colors, characters. Now, let's look at sonic cues. Leaning into sonic cues and music to make connection, well, that only accounted for 8%. More visual, less audio. But that's not the whole story. The study went a step further. The researchers next explored which of these assets had the biggest impact on brand salience. Remember, in the previous chart, the visual logo accounted for 91% of the total visual assets used. Anyone care to guess where it ranked in regards to producing brand salience? Last. Characters were actually the top performer when it came to their ability to cut through the clutter, grab attention, and bring a brand to top of mind. So, how did the audio assets fare in this battle of the visual versus sonic assets? Take a look at this. When taken together, audio assets outperformed visual assets 3-1. Sonic brand cues were the overall leader, outperforming every other visual asset and 8.5 times more likely to be a driver of high-performing ads. There's the headline. Audio assets outperform visual assets when it comes to attention and salience. And yet, they only accounted for 8% of the assets used in the ad sample. Man, talk about audio as an undervalued asset. When we begin to tie all these threads together, the science that helps us understand the impact of sound on shaping perception and behavior, the tools at our disposal to harness that power, and the strategy to help us make sound choices that can build long-term brand equity and increase brand salience, it begs the question, what role does sound play in our brand communication? And more than that, what role does sound play in our brand identity? And when we understand that our sonic identity isn't just about what we hear in a television commercial or an advertisement, but across multiple consumer touchpoints, we should ask, what role does sound play in our brand experience? And what about innovation? How are we thinking about ways that sound can become a part of our brand user interface or user experience? Or how can we use evolving technology, particularly in the world of smart speakers and voice interactivity, to engage consumers in new and meaningful ways? Well, what we're ultimately talking about here are sound business practices. We're used to using sound as a way to engage an audience, but that's just the tip of the iceberg. What about developing a sonic identity? The use of congruent, distinct, flexible, memorable, appealing, and ownable audio assets to build recognition and brand linkage. That leads us to thinking about how we're using sound across our entire sonic ecosystem, an entire brand universe of sonic touch points, not just for television commercials or radio, but for environments and retail spaces, experiential activations, product sound, navigation sounds, telephony, events. And this sonic system needs management. Style guides to help with the more consistent application and adoption of your sonic identity systems to help you manage your audio assets, including trademarks, copyrights that can help you generate royalty revenue and collateralize your assets. When we do it right, we're able to achieve tangible, measurable outcomes. Engagement strategies produce behavioral results. Let's face it, without a behavioral goal, engagement is really a meaningless metric. Identity, in turn, drives brand perceptions that will ultimately impact recognition, salience, and brand linkage. And finally, the proper management of your audio assets and sonic ecosystem will build equity, helping you make your sonic choices work more effectively and efficiently. We're not just talking about brand equity, we're also talking about building equity in copyrights and trademarks, which can be collateralized over time and even generate performance royalties that can offset the cost of production. So here's my challenge to you as we wrap up our time together. As you consider the use of sound in the context of a brand, I want you to think about a KPI, a key performance indicator, for each of these three pillars. What's one KPI for the behavior you want your sound choices to produce? What's one KPI for sound in the context of shaping brand and consumer perception? What's one KPI related to the brand equity you want audio to help you build over time? Coming up with these KPIs will do two things. First, it'll help you focus on measurable outcomes, which will then force you to think about how you're measuring the impact of sound on consumer perception and behavior. Secondly, it will force you to change the conversation about your sound choices. You'll need to think about sound strategically, much earlier in the process as you plan campaigns, experiences, and marketing communications. Sound won't be an afterthought because now you'll be thinking how to produce measurable returns on your audio investments. Now, I'm going to end by leaving you with a series of questions to further help you explore this sonic intersection of art and science. As I said at the beginning of this presentation, sonic strategy, in simplest terms, is a framework for making sound choices. Choices that should be driven not by the tactical needs of the moment, but by a long-term strategy necessary to build brand equity over time. So the next time you think about choosing a piece of music, a voice, sound design, creating a playlist, consider these categories. Ask these questions. Then use your ears and your imagination to start listening to brands in a whole new way. Thank you for taking time out of your day to explore some basic principles of sonic strategy with me. Hopefully, you'll be thinking more about the ways brands and advertising agencies can approach the use of music, sound, and voice in an interesting new way. Keep your ears open and keep listening. I hope you enjoyed MERKFEST. Adiós.
Gracias por estar con nosotros. Te esperamos a las 3 p.m. para el último bloque.
Aprovecha las promociones que tenemos para ti y todo lo que te ofrece MERKFEST.